Last time we talked about Foucault's radical period, dating approximately from the time of the student revolts of May and June 1968 to 1973 or so. But in just a few years, the ultra-revolutionary philosophies of the early 1970s contributed, somewhat paradoxically, to the wave of anti-Marxism that swept over Paris in the mid and late 1970s. The same philosophical move that had made Foucault an ultra-radical, much farther to the left than any of the established institutions of the French left, now made him a leader in the anti-Marxist reaction. There emerged a new group of philosophers, calling themselves and being called the Nouveaux Philosophes, the new philosophers. Their aim was to refute Marxism and to eradicate its influence. The new philosophers quickly seized on the philosophies of non-being and difference and dispersion as weapons to use in their fight against Marxism. They argued that Marx was a metaphysician. Indeed, Marx was the metaphysician. Interesting historical footnote is that when Marx's Capital was first published, the Auguste Comte's positivist review in its review said it was mere metaphysics. But now, a century later, Marx is again a metaphysician. Metaphysics is oppressive. They did not need to do much original work to make their case because Foucault and Deleuze and their allies had, for the most part, already made their case for them. Marx had been thought of by many, in any case, as the great 19th century philosopher who was the forerunner of 20th century avant-garde thought, but no, it was Nietzsche. Nietzsche was the great 19th century philosopher who was the forerunner of avant-garde thought in the 20th century. Resistance to concepts, to any concepts at all, because concepts are tools of power, became a widespread notion, and this went through a metamorphosis. I don't know how you pronounce that word. It changed into something like Lyotard's idea of postmodernity. Jean-Francois Lyotard tells us that it's characteristic of our age to not believe meta-narratives, or in other words, not to believe big stories. It's not that we have one general philosophical viewpoint that gives meaning to our lives and we should replace it with another. It's that any general philosophical viewpoint at all, any big story about who we are, why we are, where we're going, any such big story is not believable in our postmodern time, says Lyotard, echoed by some others. But apart from psychoanalysis, virtually the only meta-narrative that the Parisian intellectuals of the late 1970s directed their incredulity was Marxism. Their incredulity expanded, however, to doubt any materialist conception of history. It included the economic historians, who in their attempts to explain historical discontinuity studied the expansion of markets to include ever larger geographical areas, and indeed in the end the entire globe. The same economic historians that Foucault marked as targets in the Archaeology of Knowledge in '69. And we will remember that Foucault set out to dispute materialist concepts of history in the Archaeology of Knowledge, and he had combated it with a proposed methodology where the key word was dispersion. So a few years after 1969, the concept of power as the general enemy sows the seeds of a movement that will lead to a philosophy of dispersion by a different path, a path that identifies categories of thought with the general enemy. In the anti-Marxist intellectual atmosphere of Paris in the late 1970s, Foucault would declare, I'm quoting Foucault, "I have never been a Marxist." And then Foucault would depict himself as having bravely resisted the almost complete domination of French universities by Marxists and their allies. He would say that his doctoral dissertation had only been approved because he had managed to find a dissertation supervisor who belonged to the one intellectual tradition in French universities that had never been allied with Marxism, namely Georges Canguilhem. Georges Canguilhem's work, this is Foucault's supervisor when he wrote Madness and Civilization, his work in the history of science had kept anti-Marxism alive and had sheltered Foucault as history is now being revised. Well, by now the reader knows that that entity called power that reasserted itself after popular revolts such as those in France in 1848, 1870, 1940, 1968. You know that I take a different view of this repeated phenomenon of the people rising up and power putting them down. I and people who think a bit like me, co-authors and so on, think that whatever else may explain the resilience of the status quo, that is why we seem to live in a system which can't be changed, because every time you try to change it, it succeeds in reasserting itself and coming back and putting down the opposition. This resilience of the status quo can be largely explained, some of us say, by the systemic imperatives of regimes of accumulation. Here I'm using the language of Ellen Wood and language of the Grenoble School. Remember, a regime of accumulation is one that is organized in such a way that profits can be accumulated, and the analysis is that if you don't have all of your society favoring the one thing that keeps production going, then production isn't going to go, and when production doesn't go, the system has to reassert itself somehow. Now, if we think of cases where a new system came in and replaced an old system without being quickly reversed by a subsequent reaction, you might say China in 1948 was such a case. It was not very quickly replaced by a reaction. However, it gradually did move away from central planning, which it found unworkable, and into the sort of Chinese mode we know today. Or if we look at the gradual social democratic evolution of the Scandinavian countries in the beginning 1930s, we'll see that the new system succeeded for a while. And I would think neither China nor Scandinavia are cases that eventually succeeded. They all more or less succumbed to the system. In that sense, Fukuyama's book about the end of history has a valid point. Well, why were these at least temporary successes different from ones like Chile, where just quite quickly the attempt to change the system was put down? Well, from this point of view of systemic imperatives and regimes of accumulation, we want to say that these relatively successful attempts to change the system succeeded because they were able to meet basic human needs. They did not dismantle the previous regime of accumulation and leave a vacuum in its place. I suppose you could also say of Russia in 1918 and China in 1948 that the previous system was destroyed anyway. There was little more they could do to destroy it because the war had already destroyed it. In both types of case, I mean, the cases of successes and cases of failures, or relative successes and the cases of failures, those where there is change and those where there's not change, we can explain this by the ability or inability of one side or the other in the conflict to deliver reliably the daily bread that Adam Smith expected to be supplied by his baker's self-interest. And Adam Smith says we have a wonderful system, and what's wonderful about it is that the baker is going to bake my bread not because he loves me, not because he's benevolent, but because it's to his interest to do so. So we have the system that works. At least it works, as John Maynard Keynes once said, we live, our normal state is to be in a situation which is neither desperate nor satisfactory. Well, we have the system neither desperate nor satisfactory, and it keeps going, and when you try to change it, it fights back, and it fights back because, not because there's some mysterious thing called power, but because the attempt to replace it doesn't work. People don't meet their daily needs with it. It's not a tiny group of revolutionaries styling itself as the vanguard of the proletariat, which, because of Leninist science, is able to seize control of the lives of millions. And it's not even, at least not entirely, as Antonio Gramsci suggests, that the people voluntarily consent to their own exploitation because they've been socialized to believe in heart and soul and capitalist institutions. That's the theory of hegemony of Gramsci, that there's a hegemony such that all the ideas are controlled by the system, so people voluntarily consent to their own exploitation because they believe those ideas. So there has to be a war of position to do what Gramsci calls a moral and intellectual reform to generally change mentalities. We'll say, well, it's not just that. It's not just what Gramsci is talking about. It's not just the Leninist science that Althusser tried to update. It's that if you're going to change the system, you have to keep the daily bread being delivered and the production going while you're changing it. I saw that myself the very morning of September 11, 1973. I was in Santiago, Chile, and that was the day when the military overthrew Allende. And in the morning we just all learned about it. I was on my way to work, and I saw with my own eyes and heard with my own ears poor people presumed to be the beneficiaries of socialism have been standing in a long line to buy bread, or to try to buy bread. And when they heard the news that the armed forces had deposed President Allende, they all cheered and shouted, "We're free, we're free." So I'm informed and believe too, on the basis, talk about the Russian case now, on the basis of my readings, also my conversations with Alexander Kerensky. I used to talk to Kerensky, who was in exile, and I was a student at Stanford Law School, and he was at the Hoover Institute at Stanford, and we would walk together from Palo Alto to the campus. And he used to say things, which I believe anyway from other readings, that Russia being physically exhausted from World War I, and Russia was just incapable of providing the basic necessities of life for its citizens, and that made the masses impatient with democracy. And they were also not accustomed. So that provided an opportunity for the Leninists to seize power because of a physical breakdown. So what we're trying to say is that in a capitalist world, or any world whose basic cultural structure is the Western one, derived from Roman laws and institutions, and we can think of the world as a series of successor states of the Roman Empire. The sort of basic principles of law were worked out in Rome, and then Britain and France and Germany and Portugal and Spain were all sort of Roman colonies that then became nations, which then took over the rest of the world. And in some ways, the sort of basic Roman framework is now global. We live in a world where production goes forward to a large extent based on the expectations of profits, and that's within a legal framework that is basically the European one. Or my point is made by Oscar Lange in a slightly different way. In Oscar Lange's book on the economic theory of socialism, he was a great socialist economist who tried to refute von Mises by proving it was possible to have socialism. But he says, when you have the revolution, you must replace the dynamic of capitalism quickly with another dynamic, not leaving a gap between one and the other where there's no dynamic. So if there's going to be a gradual transition to a new dynamic or to a new mix, like John Dewey and Karl Popper would advocate, there's got to be a constant evaluation and revision to make sure that while we're building the new, we're not falling into an intermediate period where there's nothing. There's another image that I think expresses this, and that's Otto Neurath, the Viennese logical positivist. He has the image of renewing a wooden boat. There's a wooden boat floating on the water, and you want to completely remake the boat. Well, you can't replace the planks all at once, because then the boat would sink. So if you're going to carry out this sort of social democratic transition to a transformed society, you have to do it one plank at a time, where some set of incentives and some set of rules organizes what Marx called the metabolism of society, this interchange of matter and energy with the environment. In other words, it's work. But we can only do this by changing the rules. It can only be done by introducing different norms which channel and guide different dynamics. So from Foucault said at the beginning of The Order of Things, that society is not organized by the wills of subjects, I agree, but by its basic cultural codes. I should say I partly agree that it's not organized by the will of subjects. But Foucault says no, it's the basic cultural codes that organize. But I think Foucault was wrong to suppose that these basic codes are the ones he called epistemes that govern knowledge. We think, my co-authors and I, that the basic codes are the ones that govern eating or meeting basic needs. That the human animal, like any other animal, has to eat, and so the basic cultural code has to be the one that organizes the basic material processes of life. So from the foregoing, it would follow that ethics is important in history. You think of ethics as the rules, those are important causal powers. The historical evolution of the institutions which form the great prison that Foucault says we're all in. Foucault says we're talking of Foucault mid-70s now, that society is just like a big prison. Some people are literally in jail, but others are in factories or schools or hospitals, which are similar to jails. If you take this sort of carceral view of society, so how did this come about? Well, by the evolution of cultural codes, but not so much the epistemes that Foucault used to talk about back in his in the mid-60s, but rather the basic cultural codes that organize the production and distribution of basic goods and services like food. And people follow the basic cultural codes, the customs of the tribes, not mainly because they're following the orders of a god or a father, a chief, or a king. And so, let me mention here too that this attack on metaphysics that said we have to do away with, in the end, all general concepts because they're part of oppression. Part of that story is that people used to be dominated by gods and kings and chiefs, and then later they were dominated by metaphysics. Metaphysics is sort of a stand-in for what Derrida calls ontotheology. The ontotheology was a sort of early form. It's a theory about God and a theory about being at the same time, and that's sort of the history of oppression by metaphysics, which now we're going to free ourselves from. So, but we want to say that the reason why people mainly follow the customs of the tribe is because they work. It's because the human body is the body of a cultural animal. The human body evolved to be the body of a cultural animal, but it's still a body that must eat to live. Under normal conditions, as the biologist turned psychologist Jean Piaget shows, the human embryo develops into a creature that participates in groups with rules. Biology and culture have on the whole evolved as they have because they work. They don't work very well. They could work a lot better. They may not work many centuries more, but on the whole, they've worked. If they hadn't worked, our species would have become extinct. Even gods, even fathers, even chiefs and kings, even psychiatrists follow rules that on the whole facilitate the performance of biological functions. So when I say even psychiatrists, I'm referring to Foucault's view that there used to be priests who were sort of the allies of the military class who helped to keep people in line, and now instead of priests we have psychiatrists. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe everything I'm saying isn't right. Maybe it would be a better way to do philosophy, a better way to decide how to talk, to follow Foucault in saying that the news from biological research is all bad news for humanists. Remember, I'm bringing the good news from biological research. It's that humans are biologically coded to be culturally coded, and little kids at a certain age, there kicks in a biologically coded tendency to form gangs and groups with rules. So humans are social animals because of our biological inheritance. But Foucault is telling a different story about biology. Foucault wrote in 1970, human life is, I quote Foucault, a detour to assure reproduction, always and everywhere. In other words, human life is just a long way around to assure the reproduction of DNA molecules. Foucault, that's also what Foucault says. Maybe, now what I want to say, what we say, is that myths organize cultures, and therefore myths perform biological functions as basic as those described in the works and days of the Hesiod, another word I don't know if I pronounce right, or Hesiod or Hesiod. These works and days, one of the earliest books that's come down to us from Greek antiquity, he writes about how the myths organize agriculture and therefore survival. So, but once again, maybe we're wrong. Now, when I say we're wrong, and it's not that Foucault and I disagree about the facts discovered by the biologists. I think we both know that biologists have discovered different things. But it's a matter of, in the light of all of this accumulated knowledge, what are we going to say? How are we going to speak? It's a matter of choice of language. It's a matter of choice of how we're going to look at the world. What will be the conceptual framework for social science? So, given that this is a matter of responsible choice of speech acts, maybe it is a responsible choice or warranted by the facts, or maybe it really is, contrary to what I think, the best discursive choice, all things together, to say ethics is nothing but politics and sex taboos. And once you choose liberation as your ethical view on sex, it's really not about anything but politics, but politics is all about power. So much for ethics. And perhaps the best thing to do with power is to resist it. And perhaps the best way to resist power is to transgress rules. Maybe it is. Maybe transgression is the way to go. But in saying that maybe it would be best to forget ethics and to promote the general practice of seeking to destabilize an oppressive society by transgressing rules, I don't want to be unfair to Foucault. I don't even want to say I disagree with Foucault. And I have two reasons for not even wanting to say I disagree with him. First is because Foucault changed his mind, at least his emphasis. What he said in 1972 was not what he said in 1984. He clarified one point in 1976, in case anybody's misunderstood Foucault. Foucault said, "To use terror for the revolution is in itself a totally contradictory idea." So in 1976, whatever he may have said earlier, he says terror is out. We're not going to pull out for revolution by any sorts of terroristic activities. In 1982, he gave a seminar at the University of Vermont in which he said, or suggested at least, that he had previously overemphasized domination and power. So the whole story about power and domination, Foucault himself came to question, at least by 1982. By 1984, shortly before his unfortunate premature death, Foucault was saying things that I totally agree with. I couldn't agree more. And quote Foucault. This is Foucault, 1984. "Power should be given legal rules, techniques of management, and also of morality, and ethos, a practice of self, so that the games of power can be played with a minimum of domination." Close quote, Foucault. So that's one reason that I can't say I disagree with him, because he changed his mind. Secondly, because maybe I misunderstood him. I can never be sure I understand him. However, that said, my response to the fear that I might have misunderstood exactly what Foucault was trying to say is not to redouble my efforts to understand exactly what he was trying to say, partly because I don't think he himself really ever knew what he was trying to say exactly, if that means anything. And partly because the futile attempt to grasp the ever-receding mirage of what Foucault really meant would only divert me from what I'm really interested in. What I'm really interested in is solving problems. And to that end, I'm interested in building cultures of solidarity in which people cooperate and share resources. That is not cooperate and share, but that's not ruling out Adam Smith, because remember Adam Smith says that the clear rules of the game of the market result in cooperation. Adam Smith says this wonderful thing, we can cooperate with people we don't even know. Millions of people cooperate to make a pin through the wisdom of the market. So I'm not either pro-market or anti-market here. I'm saying that we need to work out better ways to cooperate and share without prejudging the most effective way to do it. But so this will lead to better solutions to problems, and one reason it will lead there is because that's the objective. If we say, well, what we're trying to do is solve our problems, then we're more likely to solve them than if we have some other way of talking as our discourse. Therefore, cooperation and sharing include inventing cultures that play friendly games where self-interest is harnessed, as Adam Smith recommended. Culture, and we're with Foucault on the question of diversity. That is, we want the cultures of solidarity of the future to be diverse, in a sustainable relationship to the environment, and each held together by perpetually evolving and increasingly non-authoritarian ethics. Remember the psychological finding that people who have a greater commitment to human solidarity also have a greater commitment to human diversity. They have a greater commitment to respecting other people's sexual orientations, religions, and general diversity. So it's not as though we had to choose. On the one hand, we have solidarity for economic security. On the other hand, we have individualism for recognizing individual differences. It doesn't work that way. The way it works is that the people who are more, shall we say, better developed in terms of their moral and social consciousness are both in favor of greater solidarity and greater respect for individuality. Now, skeptics will say, I know they'll say this because I heard them say it, that I'm naive to expect ethics to play a larger role in the future than it has in the past. Skeptics will say, well, all history is a history of power struggle. The more you learn about it, the more it's awful. Hegel said history is a slaughterhouse, and so on. So if I expect human nature to suddenly change, then I'm naive. In reply, I say, no, you got it all wrong. Ethics, that is to say norms, including laws, has in fact played a major role in the past. That's a history of the human species. It's a history of inventing cultures, and the better ones, or at least the ones that are not in great, the ones that are at least compatible with the physical environment, they persist, and the ones that are incompatible with physical reality don't persist. And also wars eliminate some cultures and process. So there are, history is a story of the invention by the culture creating animal, namely the human being, of different ways of life, some of which survive and some of which don't. So I want to say that if we read history better, we will see the enormously important role that human institutions made of rules and norms and laws have played in history. I also want to say something else, that today we know more about psychology in general and more about the psychology of human moral development than people knew before, and because of that we can make a better future. One thing we know is that little kids have to have basic trust and basic love. I mean, if we want to have a population without so many sociopaths and with more normal human beings, then the first thing we have to do is we have to work on very young children being loved and cared for and feeling a sense of basic trust, because that's going to make possible pro-social attitudes later. And in general, people can be educated and brought up to be better socialized, to comply with the norms, and to work harder to improve the norms because of what's known today by people who've devoted themselves to studying how humans develop. So in order to make my case, I want to make my case now that rules and norms have been in the past major factors in the historical process. I mean a historical process that has brought us to where we are today. But where are we today? Well, we're trapped, or at least we're embedded, in a global modern world system organized mainly by the rules and norms of commercial society, commercial exchange. To show the historical role of legal and ethical norms in bringing us here to where we are, I'm tempted to take a detour. By detour, I mean to comment not on Foucault himself, but on a text of Foucault himself. This is a text that Foucault takes as fundamental from at least 1970 for a decade. It's fundamental for Foucault's thought, The Genealogy of Morals by Friedrich Nietzsche. He makes this very clear in his inaugural address when he was inaugurated as a professor at the Collège de France. So I'm tempted to go talk now about Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, because he tells a little story about where morals came from, and I want to say, no, that's not right. There's a better story about where the basic morals, the basic norms of our society came from. I want to make that case in response to Nietzsche. But I'll refrain from doing that, because these are supposed to be lectures about Foucault. I don't want to turn them into lectures on Nietzsche. But what I will do, I will put the written texts of 2 essays of mine that deal with Nietzsche online, so anybody who wants to can read them. And then for the lectures themselves, we'll move on to Foucault's most famous book, which was his study of the history of prisons, how the whole idea of criminality and police and prisons evolved, which is known as surveiller et punir in French, and as discipline and punish in English. This is where we have to go to see the next phase of Foucault's thinking about power and resistance, and this is where we have to go to study perhaps his most famous concept, the concept of normalizing or normalization. So that's today.